Have you ever felt like you were living in someone else's shadow? As if your accomplishments were always overshadowed by another person? Many of us have. But few know it as well as Ishmael, Abraham's first son. His story is a testament to hope, rejection, and ultimately redemption. This story challenges our ideas about destiny and makes us question if God's promises are always true. Get ready to dive into the fascinating journey of Ishmael, a man whose name means, God hears. This is a story that will change the way you see your own life. Genesis 16 verse 4 tells us about Abraham and Sarai. They are already old and cannot have children. God promised Abraham that he would have many children. Many nations seemed far away. Sarai was sad and impatient. She made a decision that would change history. She offered her Egyptian servant Hagar to bear a child. Sarai said to Abram, "The Lord has prevented me from." Sarai said, "Go into my servant. I may have children by her." Abram listened to Sarai. This decision started a series of events no one could have foreseen. Abraham wanted to see God's promise fulfilled. The text tells us that Abraham went into Hagar and she conceived. Genesis 15:2:4 shows us that Abraham expressed his concern to God about not having an heir. "I am childless. The heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus." God said, "This man will not be your heir. Your very own son will be your heir." We can imagine the hope and expectation that surrounded the birth of Ishmael. The promised heir was finally born. Genesis 16 verse 11-12 provides insight into Ishmael's destiny. Even while he was still in his mother's womb, he was named Ishmael because the Lord had listened to his mother's affliction. He will be a wild man, with his hand against everyone and everyone's hand against him. He will dwell over against all his kinsmen. These words spoken by the angel of the Lord paint a complex picture of Ishmael's future. His name, which means, God hears, is a testimony to divine attention. On the other hand, the description of his nature and destiny suggests a life of conflict and isolation. When the moment of birth finally arrived, Genesis 16 verse 16 tells us that Abram was 86 years old when he named his son Ishmael. Ishmael was born to Abram when he was 86. It had been a long wait, but it was worth it. Ishmael was proof that God would keep his promise. In the years that followed, Ishmael grew up as Abraham's heir. He learned to lead a large clan, was taught his people's traditions, and heard the story of God's promise to his father. But Ishmael's life was about to change. He grew up believing he was the child of the promise. God's plans were unfolding in a way that no one could have predicted. The story of Ishmael reminds us that God's promises don't always come true the way we expect. Sometimes we are called to play a different role. Ishmael was the child of an unfulfilled promise. He was about to face a reality that would test his faith, resilience, and character. As he grew into a strong and skilled young man, he likely had no idea of the dramatic changes that Ishmael's position as the firstborn and heir of Abraham seemed secure. He was the fruit of a divine promise. But God's ways are mysterious. Ishmael's destiny was about to change. Ishmael's life seemed peaceful. He grew strong and learned the traditions of his people. He also learned about his future responsibilities as Abraham's heir. But destiny had a surprise in store. Genesis 21:1-3 recounts an extraordinary event that changed Abraham's family. The Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did to Sarah as he had promised. Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age. Abraham, called the name Isaac, was born to Abraham and Sarah. It was a miracle. Sarah was old but now had a baby. This was good for Abraham and Sarah, but bad for Ishmael. Ishmael must have been very upset. He had always been the son his father loved the most. Now there was another boy, born to Abraham's wife. God had told Abraham about this boy. The family had to change. Ishmael, who had been the heir, now found himself in an uncertain position. Tensions between Sarah and Hagar, Ishmael's mother, likely intensified with Isaac's arrival. These reached their peak in an incident reported in Genesis 21 verse 9. Sarah saw Ishmael, son of Hagar, mocking. The Hebrew word for mocking can mean both laughing and scorning. Regardless, Sarah saw Ishmael as a threat. She reacted harshly. 11 tells us that Sarah said to Abraham, "Cast out this bondwoman and her son, for the son of this bondwoman shall not be heir with my son Isaac." Abraham was displeased with this. We can only imagine the emotional turmoil this caused for Ishmael. Ishmael suddenly found himself at risk of being excluded from the family. The boy who once thought he was the fulfillment of God's promise now faced an uncertain future. Abraham's reaction to Sarah's demand was not immediate agreement. This suggests that despite Isaac's birth, Abraham still had a strong emotional bond with Ishmael. God intervened in this complex family situation. In Genesis 21 verse 12, God told Abraham, "Do not be displeased with Ishmael because of Sarah. Listen to her voice, for in Isaac your seed shall be called. Yet I will also make a nation of the son of the bondwoman because he is your seed." Divine intervention is significant for two reasons. First, it confirms Isaac as the heir of the promise made to Abraham. Second, it shows God's compassion for Ishmael. God does not abandon him. He promises to make him a great nation. Ishmael went from being the only son to being the undesired son. He went from being the center of his father's attention to being seen as a threat by his stepmother. He went from having a secure future as Abraham's heir to facing an uncertain future away from everything he knew. Yet even in this difficult situation, we can see God's hand at work. Ishmael was not the son of promise in the sense of being an ancestor of the Messiah. God still had a plan for his life. The promise that he would become a great nation was not a consolation prize, but a testament to God's care and faithfulness. Even in unfair circumstances, this part of Ishmael's story teaches us several important lessons. First, it reminds us that God's plans are not always what we expect. Ishmael probably thought he would be Abraham's heir. But God had other plans for him. God is always faithful, even when it seems like he isn't. Ishmael was cast out of Abraham's family, but God didn't abandon him. God had a plan for Ishmael. Life. Third, this story shows us that God can use difficult situations to fulfill his purposes. Ishmael's expulsion was traumatic, but it shaped him for the future God had planned. Finally, Ishmael's story shows us that our identity and worth are not determined by our social standing. The opinions of others don't matter. What God says about us does. Ishmael lost his status in Abraham's family, but not in God's eyes. When Abraham's family was at its breaking point, Ishmael was about to leave everything he knew and embark on a journey that would test him. Ishmael, who once thought he was heir to a great promise, was now faced with an uncertain future in the desert. But God was not finished with him yet. Ishmael's life was about to change drastically. The dawn brought a new day and the beginning of a journey that would test his strength and faith like never before. In Genesis 21 verse 14, Abraham gives bread, water, and his son to Hagar and sends her away. She leaves and wanders in the wilderness of Beersheba. The text does not provide details. We don't know if Abraham and Hagar cried, gave each other hugs, or said goodbye. We do know that Abraham gave Hagar and Ishmael the bare minimum for survival, bread and water. With these supplies, mother and son set off into the unknown. The place was not welcoming. It was dry and dangerous. Hagar and Ishmael were scared and confused. The harsh reality of the desert hit quickly. Genesis 21 verse 15-16 shows us how sad they were. The water was gone, so she put the boy under a bush. She sat across from him, about a bow shot away. She said to herself, "Let me not see my son die." So she sat opposite him. Hagar lifted her voice and wept. The water had run out. The text says Hagar put the boy under a shrub. The word "placed" suggests she did it quickly. Hagar couldn't bear seeing her son suffer. She put him in the shade and moved away. The distance mentioned, about a bow shot, shows how much Hagar wanted to be away from Ishmael but still be with him. God hears her and intervenes. Then the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven. "What ails you, Hagar?" She went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. This passage is meaningful. First, we notice that God heard the boy's voice. This shows us that even in the desert, God hears. God had not forgotten them. He promised to provide for them. The angel of God reassured Hagar that Ishmael would become a great nation. God repeated this promise to Hagar. She receives the assurance that her son's future is secure in God's hands. God opened her eyes to see a well of water. This suggests that the well was already there, but Hagar had not noticed it. God's intervention was not to create a new well, but to allow Hagar to see what was already there. The solution to our problems is often closer than we think. With their immediate needs met and God's promise renewed, Hagar and Ishmael begin a new phase of their journey. Genesis 21 verse 20-21 gives us a glimpse into how Ishmael's life unfolded from that moment. God was with the boy, and he grew up. He lived in the desert and became a bowman. He lived in the Paran desert. His mother took a wife for him from Egypt. This brief summary tells us a lot about Ishmael's development. The phrase, "God was with the boy," is significant. Despite the Ishmael was not alone. God was with him. The text tells us that Ishmael grew up. This simple word encapsulates years of development. Ishmael went from a scared and disoriented young boy in the desert to a man capable of surviving and thriving in this hostile environment. Ishmael lived in the desert. He adapted to his new surroundings. The desert was his home. He learned to navigate it to find water and food and to protect himself. The text also says that Ishmael became a bowman. This skill was crucial for survival in the desert. Archer skills were crucial for survival in the desert. They allowed him to hunt for food and defend himself against threats. Becoming a skilled archer required constant practice, patience, and precision. These qualities would be valuable in his future leadership. The text mentions that Ishmael lived in the arid desert of Paran. Ishmael was able to establish himself in the harsh terrain of the desert. This shows his resilience and adaptability. We are also told that Ishmael's mother took a wife for him from Egypt. This shows that Hagar maintained connections to her homeland. It also indicates that Ishmael was now of marrying age. Ishmael was ready to start his own family and fulfill God's promise. His journey in the desert is a story of transformation and growth. What began as a painful expulsion became the fulfillment of God's plan. In the desert, Ishmael was forged into a man. Ishmael learned to lead and thrive in the desert. This shows us that God often uses difficult circumstances to shape our character and prepare us for our destiny. The desert was challenging, but it was also where Ishmael developed the skills and strength of character necessary to become the father of a nation. The story also shows God's faithfulness to his promises. Even though it seemed impossible, God was working to fulfill the promise that Ishmael would become a great nation. Ishmael's experience in the desert teaches us about adaptability and resilience. He not only survived but also learned to thrive. This encourages us not to give up. When we face challenges, we should look for ways to grow and adapt. God helped Ishmael when he was in despair. Even when we feel lost and hopeless, God hears us and is ready to help. As Ishmael grew and established himself in the desert, he was preparing for the next chapter of his life. The young boy who once wandered lost in the desert was now becoming a skilled archer and the future patriarch of a great people. The desert became the training ground for Ishmael's destiny. Time passed, and Ishmael grew in the harsh environment of the desert. Genesis 21 verse 20 describes how God helped Ishmael become a strong and skilled man. Ishmael lived in the desert and became a bowman. The desert of Paran was a harsh place with little vegetation and steep rocks. It was a place that demanded strength and cunning. Ishmael learned to read nature to find water and hunt. He became a bowman, which was important in the desert for hunting and defense. He likely spent hours practicing with the bow and arrow. They became extensions of his body. Skill and precision. Life in the desert shaped Ishmael. He learned to be patient, resilient, and observant. Genesis 21 verse 21 tells us that Ishmael lived in the wilderness of Paran and his mother took him a wife from Egypt. This shows that he was no longer a nomad but had settled down. He learned to survive in the desert, but he also learned to thrive. His mother arranged for him to have a wife from Egypt. This shows that Hagar still maintained connections with her homeland. It also shows that Ishmael was now of marriageable age. This marriage would be the first step toward the fulfillment of God's promise. Ishmael's Egyptian wife would have brought her own skills to the union. She might have introduced new techniques in weaving, cooking, or even water conservation. Over time, Ishmael and his wife would have had children. 12 Genesis 25 verse 16 lists Ishmael's 12 sons. The firstborn was Nebajoth, followed by Kedar, Adbeel, Mibsam, Mishma, Duma, Massa, Hadad, Tama, Jeter, and Naphish. Kedemah. Each of these sons became the leader of his own tribe. Ishmael was becoming the father of a great nation. His life in the desert was not easy, but he found his place within it. He was a respected hunter and a feared protector. He knew the secrets of the desert. This knowledge was vital for his survival and for leading and protecting his growing family. As his children grew, Ishmael passed on his skills. He taught them how to use the bow and arrow, track animals, and find water. He also taught them resilience, adaptability, and faith in God. God had promised Hagar that he would make Ishmael a great nation, and this was happening before his eyes. The frightened boy who once wandered lost in the desert had now become the patriarch of a growing clan. The Ishmaelite tribe spread throughout the desert. Each tribe developed its own traditions and lifestyles, but they were all united by their common heritage. They were known for their skill as archers, endurance in the desert, and fierce independence. Genesis 25 verse 18 shows us how big the territory was that Ishmael's descendants came to occupy. They lived from Havilah to Shur, which is before Egypt, as you go toward Assyria. He died in front of all his brothers. This description covers a big area, from the northeast. Ishmael's life as an archer in the desert was not just about survival. It was also a spiritual journey. Far from Abraham's camp, where he had grown up hearing about his father's God, Ishmael had to discover his own relationship with the divine. The desert offered ample opportunities for reflection and contemplation. On starry nights, while watching over his flock or his camp, Ishmael may have meditated on the God who God had saved him as a child and promised to make him a great nation. This divine promise must have been a source of strength and purpose for Ishmael. In difficult moments, when the desert seemed relentless and the future uncertain, the remembrance of that promise would have sustained him. He knew he was not wandering aimlessly but fulfilling a divinely ordained destiny. As his family grew and his tribes expanded, Ishmael must have seen God's hand at work. The water source was a sign of God's faithfulness. The desert, once a place of exile, became the birthplace of a new nation. Ishmael's bow was not just a tool of survival but also a symbol of his identity and that of his people. The Ishmaelites became known for their bow skills. This reputation helped them hunt and fight. It became part of their culture. As time passed, Ishmael saw his children grew and formed their own families. He became a father and grandfather. He was a respected elder whose wisdom and experience were valued throughout the community. His knowledge of the desert, his survival skills, and his leadership were crucial for the establishment and expansion of the Ishmaelite tribes. As he aged, Ishmael must have reflected on his journey. He went from the pampered child in Abraham's camp to the exiled young man and finally to the patriarch of a growing people. His life was full of challenges, but he grew and had faith in God. Ishmael was a skilled archer who survived in the desert. He helped his people flourish. The desert, which seemed like a place of punishment, became the home of a new nation. The desert was now home to a strong and independent people. Ishmael's skills, leadership, and faith transformed the desert from a place of death into a place of life and growth. The archer of the desert fulfilled his destiny. Ishmael, the son of the promise that once seemed lost, became the father of a great nation. God's promise to Ishmael began to be fulfilled. The young archer of the desert had become the patriarch of a rapidly expanding clan. Genesis 25 verse 12-16 provides a detailed record of Ishmael's descendants. Sarah bore to Abraham. These are the sons of Ishmael: Nebajoth, Kedar, Adbel, Mibsam, Mishma, Duma, Massa, Hadad, Tema, Jatir, Naphish, and Kedemah. These are the sons of Ishmael. Their names are listed by their villages and encampments. There are 12 princes in their families. This list is significant for several reasons. The number 12 echoes the promise made to Abraham about his descendants. Many of these names appear elsewhere in the Bible and in historical records as names of Arab tribes. Each son became the leader of his own tribe. They settled in different areas of the desert and developed their own traditions. They remained united by their heritage and respect for their father, Ishmael. The promise God made to Abraham about Ishmael was being fulfilled. As for Ishmael, I have heard you. I have blessed him and will make him fruitful and multiply him exceedingly. He will have 12 princes. I will make him. The Ishmaelite tribes were known for their skills as archers, resilience in the desert, and independence. They developed a nomadic culture, moving with their flocks in search of pastures and water. Their mobility and knowledge of the terrain made them formidable. The influence of the Ishmaelite tribes extended over a vast area. Genesis 25 verse 18 gives us an idea of the extent of their territory. They dwelt from Havilah to Shur, which is opposite Egypt. Egypt. He settled before all his brethren. This description encompasses a significant area, stretching from the northeast Arabian Peninsula to the border of Egypt. The Ishmaelite tribes controlled important trade routes linking Egypt, Mesopotamia, and southern Arabia. This gave them a strategic position in regional trade, allowing them to thrive and expand their influence. Ishmael's skills as an archer and survivor in the desert were passed down to his sons, and each generation of the Ishmaelites perfected their skills. They adapted to changes in the environment and the challenges they faced. The Ishmaelite tribes became masters of desert warfare. They used their mobility and knowledge of the terrain to overcome larger or better equipped adversaries. Life in the desert shaped the Ishmaelites' culture and spirituality. The harsh and unpredictable environment fostered a deep appreciation for divine providence. The tribes developed rich oral traditions passing down stories of Ishmael, his exile in the desert, and the divine intervention that saved his life. These stories served to preserve their history and identity as a chosen people. As the tribes grew and expanded, they interacted more with other nations in the region. Their skills as warriors and their control over important trade routes made them valuable allies and formidable enemies. Neighboring nations learned to respect and often fear the people of the desert. The expansion of the Ishmaelites was not only geographical but also in terms of cultural influence. Their skills as archers, their resilience in the desert, and their survival techniques were admired and often emulated by other peoples. The Ishmaelites were good at navigating the desert and knew many trade routes. They also knew a lot about raising and training camels, which were good for the desert. The camels were an important part of their economy and way of life. The Ishmaelites were good at trading and transporting things with the camels. The language and customs of the Ishmaelites spread. As they expanded, the Ishmaelites adapted their nomadic way of life to the harsh desert conditions. This influenced the cultures they came into contact with. Their language likely influenced the development of later Arabic languages. As their influence grew, they began to establish more permanent settlements. They settled in good locations. These became trade and culture centers. There, Ishmaelite traditions mixed with those of other peoples. Some of these oasis cities became important urban centers in the following centuries. Ishmael's leadership was important in this process of expansion. Even in his old age, he guided his people, settled disputes, and kept them united. His wisdom was valued. The Ishmaelite tribes were skilled at diplomacy. They were in a good position to interact with other regional powers. They learned to negotiate and form alliances. They kept their independence while working with more powerful neighbors. The Ishmaelites' religion was based on the monotheistic faith inherited from Abraham. It evolved over time. They believed in one all-powerful God. The Ishmaelites' religious practices likely incorporated elements from the cultures they encountered. This fusion of traditions contributed to the rich cultural tapestry of the ancient Middle East. God's promise to make Ishmael a great nation was being fulfilled in ways that went beyond mere population growth. The Ishmaelites were a big cultural, economic, and political force in the region. Their influence went far beyond the borders of the desert. As Ishmael grew older, he could see that the divine promise was coming true. His 12 sons had become leaders of prosperous tribes. His grandsons and great-grandsons of Ishmael continued to expand the influence and legacy of the Ishmaelites. The boy who had once been cast into the desert had become the patriarch of a powerful and respected people. The story of Ishmael as the father of a nation is a testament to the fulfillment of divine promises and the power of human resilience. From a humble and uncertain beginning in the desert, he and his descendants forged a lasting legacy that would influence history. Ishmael left his father Abraham's camp many years ago. He became a respected patriarch and father to 12 princes. He was also a leader of a prosperous people. Abraham, Ishmael's father, was now an old man. He had passed away, and his wife Sarah had died too. Genesis 25 verse 9 tells us about this. The verse tells us that Isaac and Ishmael buried him in the cave of Machpelah in the field of Ephron, the son of Zohar the Hittite, which is before Mamre. This verse reveals a moment of silent reconciliation between the half-brothers long separated. Ishmael, the son of the, shows respect to their father. Both were present and cooperated in Abraham's burial. Despite their differences and years of separation, there remained a bond between them. Abraham's funeral served as a moment of unity for the entire family. Ishmael revisited his roots, saw how life had unfolded for his father and brother. Maybe it was also a time for reflection on their lives and God's faithfulness. After the funeral, Genesis 25 verse 17-18 gives us the final information about Ishmael's life. He lived 137 years. And he breathed. He died and was buried with his people. They lived from Havilah to Shur, which is east of Egypt. He lived a long and full life. Ishmael died peacefully and fulfilled his purpose. His descendants spread over a vast area from Havilah, possibly in eastern Arabia, to Shur, near the border of Egypt. The phrase, "he settled in the presence of all his brethren," echoes God's promise about Ishmael and suggests that he and his descendants maintained their independence and distinct identity. Ishmael's legacy continued long after his death. His 12 tribes grew. They multiplied and became a significant presence in the ancient Near East. They were known for their skills as archers, resilience in the desert, and independent spirit. These characteristics reflected Ishmael's own life. In Islamic tradition, Ishmael is revered as a prophet and ancestor of the Muhammad is an example of obedience to God. He and his father Abraham were willing to sacrifice themselves to God. The Quran attributes this story to Ishmael, while the Bible attributes it to Isaac. Paul uses the story of Ishmael in the New Testament. In Galatians 4 verse 22-30, Paul uses the story of Isaac as an allegory. He writes that Abraham had two sons, one by the bondwoman and the other by the free woman. The son by the bondwoman was born according to the flesh, while the son by the free woman was born through promise. The son of the bondwoman persecuted the son of the free woman. Nevertheless, the scripture says to cast out the bondwoman and her son. The son of the bondwoman shall not be heir with the son of the free woman. Paul uses this story to illustrate the difference between law and grace. Grace between works and faith. Ishmael's story is still relevant today. He is the father of a great nation. Promise. On the other, his story is often viewed in contrast to that of Isaac. However, God was faithful to his promise to Ishmael. Ishmael's story reminds us that God's ways are not always. Ishmael was not the son of the promise in the messianic sense, but he still had an important role in God's plan. His life shows how God can use difficult circumstances to shape an individual and fulfill his purposes. Ishmael's journey from rejected son to father of a nation is a story. It is a story of overcoming, resilience, and the fulfillment of divine promises. It continues to resonate through the ages, offering hope and inspiration to those who feel marginalized or forgotten. Ishmael's story reminds us that each person has a unique role in God's plan. Even when things seem against us, God can use our experiences to prepare us for a greater purpose. This is how the story of Ishmael ends. He was a man who faced challenges but also received blessings. He started as the son of a slave and became the patriarch of a great nation. He fulfilled the promise that God made to his father Abraham. God promised Abraham that he would bless Ishmael. Ishmael's journey shows that God is faithful and that the human spirit can overcome challenges. It shows that God has a plan for each of us. If you have been touched by this story, you can learn more about it here. Great stories from the Bible and how they apply to our lives today. Subscribe to our channel to stay up to date.